17 years ago, she had nothing. No home, no family, no name anyone remembered.
Before the courtroom, before the company, before any of it, Paul, there was just a little girl the world had forgotten.
He had lost his wife. He had lost his job. But that day, he gained something no...
They thought they could take everything he built with nothing but a signature and a smile. They didn't know who was about to walk through that door.
This is the story of a man who saved a little girl from the street's care, and the day that little girl saved him right back.
If you've ever believed that family is something you choose, not something you're simply born into, stay with me until the very end of this story, because what happened in that courtroom 17 years later will remind you why. And if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because you do not want to miss what's coming. Rain fell hard over the city that November night, the kind of cold rain that seeps through jackets and settles into bones. James Carter walked home from what used to be his job, a cardboard box of 10 years of his life tucked under one arm, a coffee mug, a photo of his late wife, a stapler he'd bought with his own money because the company never replaced the broken one. He had been let go that afternoon, no warning, no severance beyond the legal minimum, just a folder of paperwork and a security guard walking him to the elevator. Had passed 18 months earlier from an illness that ate through their savings faster than either of them could keep up. And now James was alone, jobless, and walking through the worst storm of the year with nothing but a box of memories and a heart that felt permanently bruised. He wasn't supposed to cut through the alley behind 5th and Marlowe. It was longer, darker, and every instinct told him to take the main road instead. But something, he would later say it was Denise, watching over him, pulled him down that narrow stretch of broken pavement. That's where he saw her. A small girl, no older than 6, pressed against a dumpster wrapped in a torn gray jacket 3 sizes too big. Her bare feet tucked beneath her in sandals soaked through. She wasn't crying. She had the look of a child who had learned that crying didn't bring anyone back. A look no 6-year-old should ever have to wear. James stopped walking. He told himself to keep going, that it wasn't his responsibility, that he had barely enough to keep himself afloat. But her eyes lifted to his, and in them he saw something that cracked straight through every excuse he was building. He crouched down slow and careful, the way you'd approach something wounded and afraid. "Hey," he said softly. "You out here alone?" The girl didn't answer, just stared, shivering. He took off his jacket, his only dry one, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "My name's James," he told her. "Let's get you somewhere warm." That night, he brought her to a shelter, expecting the story to end there, expecting the system to take over and do what systems do. Her name, the shelter staff told him, was Maya, and she'd been found wandering alone for nearly 3 weeks after her mother disappeared and her father had never been in the picture. No relatives had come forward. No one was looking for her. James signed a temporary guardianship form that night without fully understanding what he was agreeing to, only knowing that he could not walk away and pretend he hadn't seen those eyes. The weeks that followed were a blur of caseworkers, home inspections, and sleepless nights. James lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, unemployed, grieving, and now suddenly responsible for a traumatized 6-year-old who flinched at loud noises and refused to sleep unless a light was left on. Friends told him he was out of his mind. His sister asked him bluntly, "James, how are you going to raise a little girl with no job and no wife?" He didn't have a good answer. All he had was a feeling in his chest that refused to let him say no. The adoption process took nearly a year. There were days James sat in that cramped government office, filling out forms under a single flickering desk lamp, wondering if he was fooling himself into thinking a broken man could offer a broken girl anything worth having. But every time doubt crept in, he'd come home to find Maya had left a crayon drawing on the fridge. The two of them, stick figures holding hands under a lopsided sun, and something in him would steady again. The day he signed the final adoption papers, his hand trembled so badly the caseworker asked if he needed a moment. He didn't. He signed his name, looked up at Maya sitting quietly in the corner with a coloring book, and said the words that would define the rest of both their lives. "You're mine now, for good." Money was the first mountain. James took every odd job the city offered, moving furniture, delivering packages on a borrowed bicycle, working overnight shifts, stocking shelves. He learned to stretch $1 further than he ever thought possible, learned which grocery stores marked down bread at closing time, learned to sew a small patch onto Maya's only winter coat rather than admit he couldn't afford a new one. Maya, for her part, grew slowly out of her silence. It took nearly 2 years before she called him Dad for the first time, whispered so quietly he almost missed it while tucking her into bed. He didn't sleep at all that night, replaying the word over and over, afraid that if he closed his eyes it might have been a dream. School brought its own battles. Kids can be cruel in ways adults forget, and Maya, quiet, guarded, dressed in secondhand clothes that never quite fit, became an easy target. She came home one afternoon in the 3rd grade with a torn sleeve and refused to explain why. James found out anyway, from a teacher who called to say Maya had been shoved into a locker by a group of older girls mocking her clothes. That night, James sat with her at their small kitchen table, took her hands in his, and said something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. They can laugh at what you're wearing. They can never laugh at who you are, because who you are is something you're building every single day, and nobody else gets to hold the pen on that but you. Maya didn't fully understand it then. She would understand it completely, years later, standing at a courtroom podium. By the time Maya turned 11, James had scraped together enough from years of side jobs and relentless saving to buy a used delivery van. He started a small local courier business, Carter Express, running packages across the neighborhood himself, sometimes with Maya riding shotgun on weekends, sorting invoices at the kitchen table like it was the most important job in the world. She was sharper than he'd ever given her credit for, catching billing errors before he did, memorizing delivery routes after seeing them only once. "You've got a mind for this," he told her one evening, watching her recalculate a route on a napkin faster than his GPS could. She just shrugged and smiled, a real smile, the kind that had taken years to come back. The business grew slower than James wanted, but steadier than he expected. There were setbacks, a van that broke down with no money for repairs, a client who refused to pay for 3 months of deliveries, a winter so brutal that half his routes went unfilled because he couldn't afford a second driver. More than once, James sat alone at that same kitchen table after Maya had gone to sleep, staring at a stack of unpaid bills, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake trying to build something out of nothing while raising a child alone. But every morning, Maya would be up before him, backpack ready, asking if she could help sort the day's deliveries before school, and something about her stubborn, quiet faith in him made quitting impossible. By the time Maya was 15, Carter Express had grown into a small regional logistics company with a handful of employees and 3 vans instead of 1. James finally had enough to move them into a modest 2-bedroom house, the first real home either of them had known. Maya's hair, once kept in uneven puffs by a father learning hairstyling from late-night videos, was now something she styled herself in soft twists, her posture straighter, her guardedness slowly softening into a sharp, quick wit that made teachers both love and fear her in classroom debates. She was, everyone agreed, going to do something extraordinary, though nobody yet knew what. It was in her junior year of high school that Maya announced, over a dinner of James's famous overcooked pasta, that she wanted to become a lawyer. James nearly dropped his fork. A lawyer? Where's this coming from? Maya's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. Because when Mom left me in that alley, nobody with power stood up for me. You did, but you weren't supposed to have to fight that hard alone. I want to be the person who makes sure other people don't get forgotten either. James didn't say much that night. He just reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Because some moments don't need many words. Getting Maya through college was its own war. James took out loans he could barely afford, worked weekends he didn't have, and quietly sold his late wife's old jewelry, the last physical pieces of Denise he owned, to cover a semester's tuition when a scholarship fell through unexpectedly. He never told Maya what he'd sold. She found out years later going through an old box, and cried for an hour alone in her room, understanding for the first time the true scale of what her father had given up for her, silently, without ever asking for credit. By her early 20s, Maya was in law school, thriving in ways that surprised even her professors, drawn especially to corporate and contract law, the language of exactly the kind of business her father had spent 2 decades building from a single delivery van into Carter Logistics, now a mid-sized company employing over 200 people across the region. James had done it. Against every odd stacked against a grieving, broke, single black father with no business degree and no safety net, he had built something real, something that mattered, something that had quietly become his empire, which made it all the more devastating when, just months before Maya's law school graduation, everything James had built came under direct threat. A larger logistics conglomerate, run by a sharp, calculating executive named Richard Vance, had been circling Carter Logistics for over a year, offering lowball buyout after lowball buyout that James refused every time. When persuasion failed, Vance's company shifted tactics. They exploited an old, poorly worded partnership clause buried in a contract James had signed nearly a decade earlier with a since-dissolved supplier. A clause that, through aggressive legal maneuvering, Vance's lawyers argued gave his conglomerate rightful majority claim over Carter Logistics' core assets. It was a technicality stretched to its breaking point, built on legal theory more than truth, but it was enough to drag James into a lawsuit that threatened to strip him of everything he had spent 17 years building. James sat across from expensive corporate lawyers who spoke in a language designed to confuse and exhaust him. His own legal counsel, a tired, overworked attorney doing his best on a budget James could barely stretch, warned him honestly this case might be unwinnable. The paperwork was against him. The precedent leaned toward the conglomerate. Vance's team smiled in every meeting, confident, almost bored, the way people smile when they believe they've already won. In one meeting, Vance himself leaned back and said, loud enough for James to hear, "Some men build companies. Other men just borrow time before someone smarter takes it from them." James said nothing. He simply gathered his papers and walked out, jaw tight, refusing to give Vance the reaction he wanted. That night, James almost didn't tell Maya. She was days from graduation, deep in final exams, and he didn't want to burden her with a fight he was terrified he was about to lose. But Maya found the court summons on the kitchen table anyway, and when she read it, her face changed in a way James had never seen before. Not fear, not sadness, but something harder, sharper, forged from every memory of every unfair moment she had survived since that rainy alley 17 years earlier. "Dad," she said quietly, "let me help you." James protested. She wasn't even a licensed attorney yet. She had finals. This wasn't her fight to carry. But Maya had spent the last 3 years of law school specializing in exactly this kind of contract dispute. And under state rules, with her graduating attorney's supervision and special court permission for a soon-to-be barred law graduate to assist on a family case, she petitioned the court to argue on her father's behalf as second counsel, working alongside his overwhelmed attorney. The judge, after some hesitation, granted it, partly moved by the unusual, deeply personal circumstances of the case. For the next 3 weeks, Maya barely slept. She spent nights combing through the original decade-old supplier contract line by line, cross-referencing state commercial code, building a case around a detail everyone else, including Vance's expensive legal team, had overlooked. The disputed clause had never been properly re-ratified after the original supplier dissolved, meaning under state law it should have automatically expired years before Vance's company ever tried to invoke it. It was a small technical detail buried in decades-old filing records, the kind of detail only someone who had spent a childhood learning to notice what others overlooked would ever think to dig for. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Vance sat with a team of 5 lawyers in tailored suits, radiating the same cold confidence James remembered from their private meeting. James sat beside his own attorney, hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, watching his daughter walk to the podium in a sharp charcoal gray blazer, folder clutched against her chest, the same steady, watchful eyes she'd had as a 6-year-old in that alley, except now those eyes held nothing but unshakable resolve. Maya's opening statement was calm, precise, and devastating. She walked the court through the contract's history, the supplier's dissolution, the legal expiration the opposing team had conveniently ignored, and closed with a line that would later be replayed endlessly online. My father built this company out of nothing but a broken van and a promise he made to a little girl nobody else wanted. You do not get to take that from him using a clause that expired before some of your own associates were even hired. The courtroom went silent. Even Vance's lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, flipping frantically through their own files. The judge called a recess to review the newly submitted expiration documentation. It was the longest 40 minutes of James's life. When court resumed, the judge ruled clearly and decisively. The disputed clause had indeed lapsed years prior, rendering the conglomerate's claim invalid. Carter Logistics, in its entirety, remained fully and rightfully James Carter's. Vance's face, for the first time in the entire case, showed something other than confidence. He gathered his papers without a word and left the courtroom without so much as a glance back. James didn't move for a long moment after the ruling, as if his body needed time to catch up with what his ears had just heard. Then Maya turned from the podium, and the composed, sharp young lawyer dissolved for just a second into the little girl who used to wait up for him with a nightlight on. She crossed the courtroom and wrapped her arms around him, and neither of them cared who was watching, as James finally let the tears he'd been holding back for weeks fall freely. Outside the courthouse, reporters who had caught wind of the unusual case, a father who adopted a homeless child, built an empire from nothing, and was saved in court by the very daughter he'd raised, swarmed with questions. Maya, exhausted but steady, said only one thing before helping her father into a waiting car. 17 years ago, he decided I was worth saving even though nobody made him. Today, I got to prove he was worth saving too. It was a line that would end up quoted in local news articles for weeks afterward. In the months that followed, Maya passed the bar with distinction and joined a small firm specializing in protecting family-owned businesses from exactly the kind of predatory legal maneuvers that had nearly cost her father everything. Carter Logistics not only survived the lawsuit but grew stronger from the publicity, expanding into 2 new regions within the year. James, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, allowed himself to slow down, spending weekends teaching his grandchildren to be nieces and nephews how to sort delivery routes on napkins, the same way he once taught a quiet, watchful 11-year-old girl who turned out to be the smartest person he ever met. Some people build empires with money. James Carter built his with a torn jacket handed to a shivering stranger on the worst night of his life, with pasta burned 100 different ways, with jewelry quietly sold and never mentioned, with a stubborn refusal to walk away from a child the world had already given up on. And when everything he built was finally threatened, it wasn't lawyers hired at great expense who saved him. It was the very love he had poured into a homeless little girl 17 years earlier, grown into a woman who walked into a courtroom and refused to let anyone take her father's world away. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, make sure you're subscribed, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share it with someone who still believes that the family you choose can be just as powerful as the family you're born into. Because somewhere out there tonight, there's another James and another Maya waiting for one small act of kindness to change everything.